We absolutely believe that term limits are the right thing, and we're happy that they exist. None of us would probably be here without them. We understand the challenge of getting everyone up to speed in a way that their entire legislative career can be the best that it can be. And so to that end, we've set up these legislative universities. The idea of this is to get you to understand a lot of these different policy areas, to get you to understand the rules of the House, how we interact with one another, in the hopes that you can come up to speed faster, in the hopes that the power, rather than be with institutional knowledge, rather than be with outside forces, could once again be inside the legislature. And regardless of your ideology, a legislator who knows what they're doing, who knows how to maneuver through this process, is better than one that is easily affected by outside forces. So that is why we're here. I hope that you will all try to attend as many of these as you can. I certainly wish that when I first got elected that I would have had that opportunity. So today we're going to open it up with a great author that has come in to share her book with us. And we're going to talk about civility. Civility, often misunderstood, is really the way in that we interact with one another. Civility doesn't necessarily mean that we have to agree with one another. It doesn't mean that we have to meet in the middle. It doesn't mean any of those things. What it does mean is that we are all representatives of the same amount of Floridians. It means that we all want to solve the same problems, although we see them often in different ways. But it means that through that respect for one another, through being able to disagree without being disagreeable, we are a better institution as a whole. So along those lines, we have here with us Representative Kristin Jacobs that's going to come up and say some words. She's done a lot of good work in the area of civility and working across the aisle. And so I'm happy to present her to you and have her present our next guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. Thank you, Representative Avila, and good morning, colleagues. It's really exciting to have you all here and be back. Some of you are new, and I look forward to the opportunity to get to know you. So it's interesting, isn't it, a mandatory course on civility. Many of you may be thinking, well, we're pretty civil, you know. Those of us that watch us on the floor or see us in committee, it seems that although we can be boisterous and have very heated debates occasionally, for the most part, those who are watching us see a very respectful body. But respect and the way that we appear to those that are watching us shouldn't be really confused with civil discourse, because what we're talking about is not political decorum, but civil discourse. Political decorum is remembering to say, "Thank you, Mr. Speaker," or "I rise to support this good bill." Rather, civil discourse is born of mutual respect and understanding. It's picking up your microphone and saying, you know, I have been spending some time with my colleague from across the aisle, and as a result, I've come to have a new appreciation for their point of view. It's not that I agree with every single point that she is making, but we are standing here before you today having found enough common ground that we feel we can move forward. We can actually get something done. Political civility is allowing the minority party a place at the table, but it's also the minority party not poking the majority party in the eye every chance that they get. It is the opposite of dismissive. It's the opposite of prejudicial. And I would say that both parties have been guilty at one point or the other. It's understanding that vitriol has no place in our legislature, and actually it has no place in our communities either. It is understanding that the way that we behave and the way that we solve problems is affecting our communities. In fact, I think that the public, most of you would probably agree, the public is absolutely sick of leaders who are, and I use that sometimes in quotes, leaders who are stuck more on the way that they think about things, their ideology, than they are about governing. Like most of you, I've been saddened recently to see what's happened with public discourse, and that the way that some folks, from our families to our neighborhoods, are actually choosing who they're going to hang out with, who they're going to be friends with, who they think they can share their lives with based on their political labels. How sad that we would get into that place. As leaders in our communities, it's up to us to be able to show that when we have our differences, we can pull together to solve common problems, together. Because if we fail in showing the public that we can do this, if we fail in that regard, then it is almost certain that the public will remain in their ideological silos. If we succeed, however, I firmly believe that the public will follow suit. In fact, I am convinced that both sides yearn for us to actually be the way that we used to be. For about 2 years now, I've had the happy opportunity to be involved with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And I would encourage anyone who's interested to check with me afterwards. I'd love to tell you about them. They are out of the University of Arizona. They are a bipartisan foundation focused on helping our nation's state legislators build trust with one another and figure out how you can move forward to get things done. I've learned so much from them. I've learned that the foundation for building and bridging that divide amongst the parties and the different ideologies is really as simplistic as spending time with one another. It's seeking to understand one another. It's, on a personal level, getting how and why someone thinks the way that they do. It's believing wholeheartedly that compromise is not capitulation, but it is, in fact, the very foundation of our democracy. So, to borrow from decorum, I don't know if our speaker is here, but I didn't see him in the room. But thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for your commitment to the principles of civility. Thank you for your leadership. And thank you especially for keeping your word and delivering on a promise from day one to take this legislature in a new direction. So now I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. She's just awesome. I feel like I know her just from doing some of the research on her. Whoops, I have the wrong page, hold on. Toby Scarborough is an entrepreneur and a motivational speaker who served in the White House Office of Presidential Advance and as Protocol Officer in the U.S. Department of State. Throughout her career, Ms. Scarborough worked with such notable figures as His Holiness Pope John Paul II, Presidents Reagan, Bush, Ford, Carter, and Nixon, President Walesa of Poland, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth and the members of the royal family, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and even Nelson Mandela. She is a published contributing author for The Power of Civility, a book that explores the various ways civility is a part of our world and how civility still remains a worthy goal of society, and for another book upcoming called The Crisis of Engagement, with an entire chapter devoted to civility called Engaging in Civility. Please join me in welcoming Shelby Scarborough to the Florida House.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Representative Jacobs. Hello, good morning. Is this fun? I'm so excited to be the first speaker in this newly decorated room. Is this the first time most of you have been in here? Very good. Well, thank you for having me. I came down from Washington last night into this lovely weather, this storm. The storm, isn't that, that's actually kind of emblematic of some of the things that we may be feeling about what's going on in our political and civil discourse these days. But maybe I can talk about a few things that might ease our tensions a bit around the subject. What Representative Jacobs and I did, that ceremonial handshake, right? How many times did you do that this morning? Think about it. And here you probably did it at least 10 times. But did you think about why? Or how it started? It actually started a bazillion years ago, and it shows up in ancient Greek and Roman architecture. People came off the battlefield wearing these big gloves, protective gloves, and when they came to the center of the battlefield to declare a truce, they took off their gloves and placed their hands together skin to skin. Why? They said, we're coming in peace. This was their moment of truce. I come in peace. There's traditions in all sorts of cultural situations, social situations, religions. Sometimes in church you have the peace, you turn around and say, peace be with you. These are all parts of that convention. A gesture, the decorum, as Representative Jacobs was talking about earlier. But now we have fist bumps and Facebook. And I don't know about you, but this could be kind of hip and cool and fun and trendy. But as far as long-term tradition, it doesn't really scream, I come in peace. Not to me, anyway. These are all forms, just, it may be a gesture, it may be just kind of a tradition, but it's the underpinnings of what I look at as civility. Civility is far more than that, as you alluded to. Civility is far deeper than that. And we have many traditions that can, in our own culture and in our own country, that can teach us a lot from this about civility in general. George Washington actually was kind of hip to this subject way back when. He was about 16 years old, and he took a French etiquette book that was about 200 years older than he was, and he translated it into a book that has now become known as George Washington's Rules of Civility. 110 rules that are, some of them are kind of funny. I'll share some of them with you. Some of them kind of crack me up because they really don't make much sense to us now. But ultimately, most of them really have a resonance that are good to this day. And if you just look at them for their deeper meaning, we can take a lot away from them. One of them, spit not into the fire, nor stoop low before it, neither put your hands into the flames to warm them, nor set your feet upon the fire, especially if there be meat before it. Kind of outdated, right? I mean, how many people, did you run at Thanksgiving, did you run into your family home and tear your shoes off and stick your feet in the oven next to the turkey? I don't think so. But so some of them don't seem to make sense. But obviously this is kind of, at the time, it was about being courteous to the others around you, etc. This one I actually like. Roll not. We might see this a little bit on television and in our own chambers, etc. Roll not the eyes, lift not one eyebrow higher than the other, wry not the mouth, and bedew no man's face with your spittle, whether intentionally or unintentionally. I like that. By the way, the grammar is all his, not mine. Rule number 50, be not hasty to believe flying reports to the disparagement of any. So that's pretty basic. Gossip and telling tales out of school wasn't good then, and it's really not a great practice now. All of these come down to 5 or 6 things. When you really boil down every rule, and I've spent a lot of time dissecting this rule book. I know that sounds extremely exciting, but I have a passion around this subject, and they all come down to some basic concepts that we can take away, that we can employ every single day whenever we start to open our mouths and say something to somebody else, whether it's in email, on the phone, on the floor, to your family, to your friends, to your colleagues. Trust and respect, dignity, honor, courtesy. One of my favorites, duty, which all of you are serving right now, and humility. Bringing those concepts to everything we say to somebody else. I mean, how often do we actually stop and think about, am I going to treat this person with respect? Is this a form of courtesy? Am I showing them courtesy, dignity, respect, honor? Am I upholding the honor of what I've been asked to do? So about a bazillion years ago, not quite as old as ancient Roman Greek architecture, I worked in President Reagan's White House, and it was my very first job out of school. I didn't know a whole lot, and very fortunate to have my very first boss be Ronald Reagan. That's not such a bad start. And he was such an emblematic representation of dignity, respect, trust, honor, duty, courtesy, humility, civility. And I realized then I was a lot thinner and I like to stand like this, I guess, just about every picture. One of the things that he did, one of my very, very first experiences with him, was walking down a hallway, and I was in presidential advance. So what that was is we went ahead, we prepared the visit of the president to whatever it might be, whether it's just down the hall or across the country or around the world. So in one of my very first experiences, I was sort of put out there to do one of the more simple things, which was get him from point A to point B. And we were walking down the hall, and we got to an elevator. And I said, Mr. President, I was doing my job. I said, Mr. President, after you. He said, well, no, after you. No, I spent a little time with him. I heard it a few times. Of course, I said, no, please, after you. It's my job, please don't, after you. And he says, no, after you. And we did this a couple times, and the Secret Service finally said, just get in the elevator, please. Okay. I don't want to cause an international incident. Please. So I got in the elevator. Of course, then I had to like scoot around him and get out and just to get up ahead to be able to lead him to the next stop so that he could do his job. Part of presidential advance is to just do the groundwork, make sure everything's smooth. All that connections between here and there are all taken care of so that the president or any leader can stand at the podium or sit in the meeting and do what they're supposed to do. Focus on the substance of the meeting, not how they're getting there and what they're doing. But this was a very basic lesson for me on courtesy and respect. It was decorum, yes, but it was more than that for him. It was about who he was. He was a gentleman. You know what? And I'll take that any day. He basically taught me to put others first. It wasn't just about getting in the elevator first. It was, I'm putting you ahead of me in everything I do. And he behaved that way at all times. When he met with General Secretary Gorbachev, right before they kind of connected, he had been watching this guy and he said, I think I can work with him, much unlike his predecessors. Partly because all his predecessors kept dying off. That was sort of a fundamental problem. Before you could get a conversation started, they disappeared. But now here was this young guy who was it seemed like he was giving hints that he was interested in reform and interested in working with the United States. And we're talking obviously on big issues of the time. I mean, no less than now, big issues of proliferation, nuclear proliferation, disarmament. How do we go about this? No, you first, right? You first. I'll do it. No, you first. Well, how do you get that conversation going except to sit down with one another and actually have a conversation? So he says, okay, let's get together. So they meet in Geneva, Switzerland. And not a lot of substance, not a lot of massive change came out of that meeting, but there was a massive change in the relationship. And before you can actually do anything, I believe you have to have a foundation for the conversation. And that's what happened in Geneva. They came together, shook hands, I come in peace. And then President Reagan said, call me Ron. Not Mr. President, not Mr. General Secretary, call me Ron. And he said, let's go take a walk. And they went walking through the gardens in Geneva at Flordeau, where they walked side by side. Now you got to picture this, right? First of all, you got 50,000 people like me running around going, oh my God, they're not following the script. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. Well, wait a minute. Aren't they doing what they're supposed to do? They're just walking, two men side by side, two leaders of major countries, two adversaries, but walking together in the same direction. I mean, the visual of that to me is super important. In fact, I just got chills. It really served them well as they developed their relationship. Oh, there we go. As they developed their relationship, if you can, anybody into neuro-linguistic programming, just a little manipulation there. Yeah, for people who know it, know what I'm talking about. These guys, if you look at it, the rapport that they're building there, even in their body language, right? They're facing each other. They're both crossing their legs. They're doing the exact same thing. There's a good little bit of it right here, little rapport going on. Not to put you on the spot. It all came in handy when they ended up having a little bit of trouble later on when they were in Reykjavik. And they had to literally walk away from the table. So when you talk about civility, you talk about decorum, you talk about political civility, you talk about communication, it doesn't mean you're not going to disagree. It means you're going to have a pathway, a bridge to find your way back to the conversation once you find those hard points. Because there's no way in the world that two people agree on absolutely everything, much less two parties, much less two countries. So they were able to get back to the table, and the end result, even while this gentleman here, who actually is one of my heroes, said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The State Department said, I don't think you should say that. Warning, danger, Will Robinson, don't do that. You'll really make him mad. And President Reagan had kind of a gut about this. He knew. He said, this guy is stronger than this. This guy, I'm not personally denigrating him. I'm giving him a challenge to really step up and do what he's been saying he wants to do all along. And I'm doing it pretty publicly. Minor detail. I actually happened, just an aside, I happened to be off to the right of that. To the right of that was a kind of a platform. There was a backstage area and a platform where you could walk up the steps and look over into Berlin, into East Berlin, over the wall. And it was really eerie because if you looked, look to the left, you see all these people cheering, lots of noise, just as far as you can see, people waiting to hear this speech. And if you looked over into East Berlin, crickets. And we actually put speakers facing into East Berlin so that the East Berliners could hear the speech. And I was told later by President Reagan's, one of his former chief of staff, that that he met a kid who had been there listening, hearing the speech. And that kid is now, I think he's now an American. We do have impact. Our words have impact. One way or the other, they definitely have impact. This was a magical moment in many ways, and it's okay to be strong in your beliefs. But it's not okay to denigrate the other person's beliefs in the process. It finally culminated in a signing ceremony in the heart of the Kremlin in 1987, and I remember that well because I had zero sleep for about 3 weeks. And I remember being a little bit, what was it? I was standing in the back of this room. In fact, I think I'm just out of the picture. Of course, I'm out of the picture because if you're in the picture in my job, you're in the wrong place. That was one of the lessons I learned. My job was to set up the picture, not be the picture, not be the news. One of the things that somebody said to me in that room during the signing ceremony as I'm watching this historic moment, and I'm exhausted, and I jumped in the motorcade and went to watch the ceremony because why not? That's why I was there in the first place. But I was sort of too tired to appreciate it. And a guy next to me said, I can't believe I'm standing here watching this historic moment. I just can't believe it. And he'd been at the embassy for 3 years, which was about the length of time that most embassy personnel kind of stay in one place. And he said, I've never been inside the Kremlin. And I thought, okay, Shelby, you really need to get a grip here because I'd been there about 10 times in the last 2 weeks, just helping set up some of the things that were going on. And that really was a wake-up call for me about appreciating the moment, appreciating where I was, my duty, my responsibility, the honor that I had to serve, just like you guys have now. Taking this moment to breathe it in, to live it, to appreciate every single second of it, and the responsibility that we have to the people who we're representing, essentially. And so at that moment, I realized I actually was that was when I kind of got it, that I was actually part of something a lot bigger. Rather than I wasn't just somebody toiling away in the depths of the White House, not really looking out. I had to look up and look out at what I was doing and who I was affecting by the work I was doing. And I was just a small cog in the wheel there. But we all had impact. We all had the opportunity to make a difference in this. Now, how many people remember Tip O'Neill? I'm aging you all. Okay, so I remember Tip O'Neill as well. So this is a great example of bipartisan relations. They could argue like you can't believe. I mean, they would use really bad language with each other too, but it was in the best way possible. You so-and-so, that kind of thing. But they knew, they had the basis of this friendship, and they were able to communicate with one another on the hard issues. And they did some tough negotiating. But they ended up, if you can look at the rapport that's here, it is clear. These are just a couple of snapshots, but this is the reality of the relationship. And these two men found a way to communicate with each other and still get the job done, and still stand firm on their beliefs and their commitments to their different worlds, but at the same time find a way to work together to achieve a greater good. So I go back to General Secretary Gorbachev and the depth of a relationship and the incredible meaning. It seems so simple, too simple to say. The incredible meaning that this relationship had. It's basically friends till the end. I mean, this is President Reagan's funeral. And General Secretary Gorbachev came and sat in the front row to honor his friend. Now think of sort of that kind of scenario today. Right now, it doesn't seem like that's possible. But this was because these men spent a lot of time trying to work things out for the betterment of the entire world. This man was there at his funeral. His other great friend, Margaret Thatcher, came to the funeral. I can tell you a couple of stories about her. She carried this dress with her for like 10 years in case he died when she was on the road. I mean, that's commitment. And it fit her for 10 years. I wish I had that, that good luck. She also did a video a couple of years prior to this funeral because she was starting to lose the capacity to stand in front of an audience and communicate her message. But she really wanted to honor him, so she videotaped her message. And we had a big argument. I was the number 2 person on the funeral staff in Washington, D.C. for the activities in Washington, D.C. And we had a big argument. I had a big argument with the number 1 guy because he kept saying, oh, well, we can't have her do her video if she's sitting in the audience. That'll be weird. I said, well, again, you got to think of the bigger picture. First of all, the audience is the world. It's not just right here in front of us. It's not just the people standing here. Plus, most of the people, I was in the cathedral and I came in the motorcade, so I stood in the back of the room. I didn't even see her at all during the time period. So it wasn't as if we were going to have any issue with that. So I won, of course. Oh, I don't want to gloat, but every once in a while there is a nice victory there because it was the right thing. It was the right thing to do, to play her video. And when we went through the funeral, we were up on Capitol Hill. All of these dignitaries were in a room, in a reception, waiting for this hall to open and for people to be able to go through and pay their respects. And as an aside, right before this happened, we were in this room having this nice reception, and the doors burst open, and the Capitol Hill police came in and said, evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. Oh my goodness. That was one of my worst fears, was we had a lot of heads of state, a lot of leaders concentrated in the Capitol building. This was obviously pre-9/11, but it was definitely a concern. And to have the police come in and say, evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. Oh my goodness. We ran through the streets of Washington, D.C. towards Union Station, if you know the geography. I'm running next to Dan Quayle and Peggy Noonan and Bill Bennett and all these famous characters from all that era. And we're running down the street, and all of a sudden they say, okay, it's all clear. So we all walk back, and we walk back into the room, get ready. And it turns out it was we didn't know it at the time, but it was the governor of Kansas who had been in a private plane flying into DCA, and he buzzed the Capitol a little too closely, and nobody was answering. The pilot wasn't answering, so they had no idea who it was. A little behind the scenes on that. So then we all pulled ourselves together again, took a deep breath, and commenced with the ceremony at hand. And as we were thinking about it, when we do presidential advance, we have the opportunity to think through every single detail of what's going to happen. And on that line, as a metaphoric example, is just because we have the opportunity here to have every single detail outlined, the point of having every step of the way outlined is so that when you have to take that left or right turn, that you can get back on track. Not that you never deviate from the plan. So we didn't have a huge detailed plan for that moment because it was such a quick thing that we had to put together, even though we only had 20 years or so to put it together. We managed to have to put a lot of those details together in the last, escort her around to the coffin so that she could pay her respects. And one of the most beautiful things is I thought about saying to him, okay, can then you stand up back and get out of the picture? But I thought, well, maybe I'll just let him use his judgment on that because I think he knows what to do. Which, of course, he did. You don't see him in that picture. He stepped back, let her have her moment. He didn't take any credit for this. He could have tried to be right there in the picture. He could have tried to grandstand and make his point and be the guy. And he didn't. He stepped back. And that I had such respect for. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. Not too long after my service with President Reagan, I started my own company, and one of my very first clients was Nelson Mandela, my very first client was Nelson Mandela, which was such an honor. I mean, talk about a civil guy, my gosh. I mean, spend 26 years or so in prison, and you could have the right to be a little pissed off, right? Sorry, my language. But he was very unbelievably gracious at every turn to everyone, to a person. He couldn't have emulated the word grace more, in my mind. The other person who stands out in my mind and my experience that I had the honor of working with was Pope John Paul II. This was at the consecration of a children's hospital in Krakow, Poland. Just before this picture was taken, we had been just inside those doors, and there was a room about this big, and it was crowded with VIPs, presidential delegations, congressional delegations, American, Polish, etc. But over here was these little wooden stools, and on the little wooden stools were the children who were well enough to get out of bed from the children's hospital, and they were about this big, and they were wearing little hospital gowns or pajamas with little characters on them, and some of them were bald because they were going through chemotherapy and cancer treatments. I mean, it was breathtaking when you walked in. Here we're having this sort of celebration, and then you turn and you look at, oh, this is why we're here. This is the meaning of why we're here. It's not all pomp and circumstance. It's not all about shaking hands with dignitaries. It's about doing the work that we're here to do. And the Pope, obviously he knew this. I mean, he gave his speech, the consecration of this new wing of this hospital, and at the end of his speech, without prompting, without scripting, he walked over to every single child and blessed every single child, touched their head. And I mean, of course, I'm not even Catholic, and I was crying through the whole thing. It was so touching. Again, he was connecting with his constituency. Absolutely, literally connecting with them. Does this look familiar to anybody? I know it does to me. It's not, we're so connected now, but we're so disconnected. We're so engaged with everything all the time, but we're also kind of disengaged in a strange juxtaposition. And how do we kind of reconcile those two things? We have to do it step by step every day. It's not just a switch that you turn on. This is a practice. It's a practice of civility. It's a practice of engagement. To me, civility is service. It's about a servant heart, and that's why you're all here, to serve your communities. It's about results. If we work together, look what we can do. And it's really about leadership. So it's not this manners and decorum and niceties. It's essential to what we're doing every single day. I think of it as like a quilt. When you think of all the patchwork quilt, and now quilts aren't really handmade anymore, and anybody who does them, God bless them, because it's tedious, tough work to make a quilt, to hand stitch a quilt. And I think of all of us as the stitches between the patchwork, that we are all the reason that it's being held together. And if we let that rot, if we let those threads rot or disintegrate, and we don't take care to make sure that it's nice and tightly stitched, our society, the fabric of our society, tends to kind of pull apart. And I believe, the handmade quilts of back in the day are about as strong as you could ever imagine. I have one that's over 200 years old from somebody in my family who made it. And it's still going strong. But that means that we have to, forget the machine-made stuff, right? We got to do it ourselves. We've got to get in there and connect everything ourselves. I've written myself a civility pledge, and I don't, if it resonates with you, that would be fantastic. I talk about, I strive to set aside pride and ego. That's one of the things that gets in the way so much of our conversations. How much? I have it every day. Believe me, traveling down here, I was just laughing to myself and saying, okay, you need to find the joy in the moment. because there's some things that are frustrating, simple stuff. But you know what? It's a first world problem. I got to Tallahassee in, record time, and it was no big deal. But there's things that get in the way of a really easy trip sometimes. Well, so what? That's what happens every day. That's what happens. It's going to happen to you. Every day, probably. There's going to be something that's going to challenge your ego. I mean, we got to get away from putting that first. We got to put that last if we can. Building trust and rapport. Spend the time to build those relationships. This is what I try to do. Get to know people personally, one-on-one, not by group, not by label, not by party. Have a party. That's probably the best idea there ever was. That's what they used to do on Capitol Hill, and that's what they've gotten away from. And I've heard many, many people tell me the same thing, that we, meaning members of Congress, we used to socialize. We used to have barbecues. Now they fly home or they're campaigning, and because it's the cost of the elections, I mean, there's lots of reasons why it is. But that just means we have to spend that much more time really stitching up that quilt. Find, share, spread joy at every opportunity. My middle name actually is Joy. And aside from Civility, my mission is to find joy at every opportunity and enjoy the journey, right? Find joy in the journey, because happiness is a destination, so you might as well enjoy the journey, because getting to happiness sometimes is a little far off. It seems a little vague. But if you think about it, how can we do that here? How can you spread a little joy? How about a smile? How about saying hello? How about holding the elevator door? There's simple things that can help get that relationship going and help us connect the stitches of that fabric. Communicate with empathy, respect, compassion, understanding. I mean, these aren't just words. These are really important things to do. And to think, to listen, to learn, right? To listen before we speak. We're always so anxious to have the answer that we don't listen to what the person is actually saying sometimes. That's a really common issue. That's because of pride and ego. It's a big circle. Treating people with dignity, patience, kindness. I went home 5 years ago from Washington to California. Now that's been an interesting journey for a Republican in California. And better yet, I went home to take care of my family because my parents needed help, and they're aging, and they're facing issues that are just not very fun at all. And helping, I think one of the biggest things between helping them find joy in the small moments when some of the bigger moments seemed a little less than joyful, is helping my parents keep their dignity as they age. And respecting that they're still my parents. Even though I'm helping them a bit now with things that they might have helped me with earlier in my life. They did help me with, and now it's my turn to return the favor. Withholding judgment, boy, that's a tough one. That's so easy that hair trigger to just be able to just go right to, wait a minute, but you, and where does it get you? Where does it get anybody? It's certainly not getting us anywhere in the discourse of the country. And seeking solutions for the good of the whole. My dad says if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. He heard that from somebody, somewhere, but I'll give him all the credit. Let me finish by telling you a story about Josh Yant. Josh was I wouldn't say typical kid, he was a kind of atypical. He had some learning issues, and it made him a really rich target for bullying as a kid. When he went to high school, he decided to change the course of his life. And I don't know that when he said, okay, I'm going to go to high school today, I'm going to change the course of my life. I think deep down, he just knew intuitively that he needed a shift. He needed something. He needed to do something. Now, rather than be angry, which he had probably every right to be angry. Right. I have a right to be angry. I have a right to my view. I have a right to my position, of course. But what I love about his story is what he did was he took control of his own destiny and he turned the tables on everything. He went to the front door of his school, and kind of like Ronald Reagan, he held the door open for everybody who followed. And he did that the next day, and the next day, and every day thereafter. And he became known as the doorman. His action, small, little, tiny little action, had great, great effect on his school, on his peers, on his community. I think he was elected homecoming king. So, small victory in that world. But my God, what a major shift happened by that small action, by that small act of kindness, by showing people courtesy that he had not been shown. He had been denied that. And in fact, experienced quite the opposite. And this was his payback, right? Retribution, showing the courtesy. I guess what I hope every time I talk to a group of people is that when you shake hands with somebody, that you think about why you're here, why you're doing it, that you come in peace. We come with the purpose of doing great things for our people, for our constituents, for our state, for our country, always in everything we do. And maybe when you hit a door or an elevator, that you'll all bump into each other, trying to help each other, offering it up first, putting the person behind you first in everything we do, and saying, after you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions if anybody has any. Yes?
Were you there when he tore the wall down?
I was there when he said tear down this wall. I was not there when they tore the wall down. I have a piece of it. Just a little block in lucite. Go ahead.
Good morning. Do you have books for those of us in the back who did not get one?
You didn't? Yes. The answer is yes.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Anybody else? Go ahead.
I feel like the biggest cause of modern day incivility is because it's perpetuated by our media as being cool and hip and the thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
How do we combat that? It's too huge. It's all invasive, and especially to younger generations, that is their role model now.
It is, and it's somewhat unfortunate. And yet, just like Josh, we can't control everything outside of our world. We can control our world. So yes, there are things we can do, coalitions and discussions and debates and conferences and things like that, to have the public discussion on that issue and try to work with the media, et cetera. But the bottom line is, what can you do as an individual right here and right now is live civility. You can just, and be vocal about it. I mean, sometimes it's nice to be subtle and have people not see that it's an outward manifestation. But then there's other times to say, no, this is a very deliberate act that I'm doing, especially with your children, right? Especially with school children, is to be able to say, no, I want to talk to you about civility. I want to teach you about how to communicate with your neighbor. I want to tell you it's okay if you disagree with me. It's okay. I'm going to listen to you, and I hope that you will listen to me, and that we can have a conversation around this. It's my only point in this is, and the only thing that I can think of personally, is just to embody it yourself. And we can, if I talk to enough people, maybe we can spread it around a little bit. Anybody else?
What was it about Gorbachev's personality that permitted him to step out of the usual role of a Soviet leader, a global leader?
I think youth actually had something to do with that. His age difference between his predecessors was so huge, and I think he was, we talk about the media, he had a little bit more exposure to the rest of the world and had a little less hardline views on things, and saw that there was an opportunity. And I think, he was ultimately a man of peace, right? He wasn't a villain. He was a man who really wanted to do the same things that we want to do, is have a peace and prosperity for our people. Different systems that we may not always agree, but that common goal was what was able to have them have the conversation. Anybody else?
Scarborough, your part of this book is to say and not to say?
Yes.
That's the question?
Yes.
Expand on that a little?
Sure. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. Just because we have freedom of speech doesn't mean that we need to have just, spew everything we're thinking all the time, right? If you put it in the context, I mean, sometimes this parallel doesn't always work, but if you think of it in terms of being a parent, most people in here are parents. I'm not, but I deal with children all the time, and I think that one of the things that you look at as a parent-child relationship, how many times do you just sort of not say something when you really want to? But it's probably better just to hold it back a little bit. So all I'm saying in this chapter is, and I reread it recently, and I thought, it's pretty good, actually. It stands the test of time. Is that we need to just step back and realize think before we speak, and recognize that political instability actually is not new. Big surprise, but it's been around for a long time. Mudslinging, the word came around for a reason. It wasn't metaphorical. It was they really did. And ask Hamilton about how things happen. Things like duels, and there's ways that people defended their honor in ways that hopefully we don't do. So if we think we're bad now, I mean, it's a war of words in many cases, but that does have consequences. Words do still have consequences. So that's kind of the main gist of that. Anybody else? Thank you very much. Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Isn't she awesome? Thank you so much. So just closing out, I just wanted to share with you, as a freshman, we have a lot of freshmen in this class. One of the ways the mysteries get solved in this place is when others from a different class come and visit you, and especially to those in leadership. So for those who are in leadership, to stop by, especially if it's from the other party, the honor of having somebody in leadership pop by your office when you're a peon freshman is huge. And if you're in leadership, you may not think it's such a big deal, but it really is. And so whether you're in leadership or you're in any stage, I would encourage you to seek out our freshmen, spend some time with them, because at the end of the day, it's all about creating relationships and friendships. It's hard to hate or be angry or say bad things to the press about someone that you have a relationship with. So creating relationships, as we all know, we hear it all the time from the very, very first day that you're a freshman. It's not a cliche. It truly is. The way we move forward is by connecting with one another and hopefully have a better civil discourse in the process. So thank you, Shelby, for such a great message today. All right, so we have a lot of different places that we can be starting up at 10:15. You have mechanics of the state budget. You also can choose the rules of the Florida House, or what do the changes in rules mean for me. That begins at 10:15. You'll see it on your sheet here. And please remember to note that there are some classes today that are mandatory. There's 2 more and they are mandatory, and the rest of them are up to you. So choose what you want, and we hope that you enjoy everything that's being put forward for you today. Thanks, everybody.